Hello, Dr. Ibby.
Hello, Dr. Joe.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just getting excited about talking about culture today. And as we're both sort of humanities academics, that's one of those words that we like to come up with definitions for, which some people might be a bit startled by because it's one of those words that you probably use all the time.
Yeah.
But in kind of humanities, when you talk about something like culture, you have to define it. So we're going to define it, and then we're going to talk about it in some games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah, actually, what the plan was for today was talking about accents and dialects. That was the plan.
We were playing a very specific new game, and some of you may be aware of it. It is called Thank Goodness You're Here, and it is a very funny game set in the kind of northern part of England with very specific regional humour. It's published by Panic, who made Untitled Goose Game, or who published Untitled Goose Game, sorry. And we initially played it thinking we were going to find this really impenetrable wall of accent, because we'd heard like American podcasters talk about this game as being really difficult to understand.
Yeah.
And then when we played it as kind of like British people, you've been here for like 7 years. We didn't find we really needed the subtitles on or anything.
We started playing it, in fact, and then after about 10 minutes, we realised that there wasn't much going on in terms of dialect or accent that we found difficult to understand.
Yeah.
And so we thought, maybe we got the settings wrong. And we restarted it, trying to make sure that we had not the sort of standard English.
We tried to set it to the hard mode for accent.
And then we restarted it and it was the same. So,
but there is a history in America of not being exposed to that accent as much. And I think like the earliest I remember ever hearing an American program that had a northern accent in was the housekeeper in Frasier. And even then she didn't use the like idioms or the particularities of how someone from that part of the world would talk. She talked in American English, she just had an accent. And if you go back 20 years ago when you started to have people appearing in like the MMA who were from the north in England, like English, Northern English fighters, they would subtitle them on American TV.
Oh, interesting.
Which, again, I don't think it happens as much now, but there was definitely a time period where, we know, and most people will know, that Britain has a lot of different accents condensed into quite a small space, compared to, like, it's a country the size of an American state.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily translate well overseas, and that's why you have, like, the BBC accent that people in the media often speak with, even if they're from Scotland or something. But we just didn't find that we went to that game expecting to find a lot of interesting stuff, and I think we did, but it was mostly about the humour and the tone of the humour rather than the way that people speak.
But that doesn't mean that we can't anchor our discussion today in Thank Goodness You're Here, because one of the sort of thing that it made us think about actually was representation of real culture in video games, or realish culture in video games. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And real culture as opposed to purely fictional worlds.
Yeah.
So what we're not going to touch today is representation of cultural groups in games like The Elder Scrolls or...
The Elden Scrolls, it says in the notes here. We sort of combined Elden Ring and Elden Scrolls into one thing.
Baldur's Gate,
Yeah.
the D&D world, that kind of thing.
And
So
we did talk previously about how in fantasy and science fiction you're often taking like real world cultures, and obviously there's a way that maps onto like racism of having like a group of people that are more like barbaric, and then that having kind of elements of Aboriginal culture mapped onto it and stuff. We're not talking about that, where culture is kind of euphemistically transferred into fantasy. Some of these settings, like in Thank Goodness You're Here, some probably more well-known indie games, like things like Night in the Woods, Life is Strange as well, have these places where, okay, it's a made-up town, but it's a made-up town in a very specific part of the world that has a kind of local culture to it.
Yeah.
Thank Goodness You're Here isn't just generic England, it's a very specific cultural milieu. Night in the Woods is in the Rust Belt in America. It's not just any town America kind of thing. So these are representations that are based on trying to get at some kind of realistic depiction of what a particular place in the real world is.
It's fictionalized real world rather
Yeah.
than purely science fiction worlds
Yeah,
or fantasy
exactly.
worlds, right?
And obviously there's a spectrum of how this is graded. Like I gave you the Batman example earlier.
Yeah.
Where there's a funny debate online about which city Gotham is most based on. And then someone found an image of Batman eating a pizza. And because he's folded the pizza to eat it, I think that's more associated with Chicago. I can't remember. They were arguing between whether it was Chicago, New York, or Detroit. And the pizza folding became like the crux of... Which is a really good example of what we want to talk about today, right?
Yeah.
Like a sense of place and how that relates to the people there and the customs and all of these things that we uncritically refer to as culture like every day. But I mean, if you...
Well, you say that. I feel like there is people who might not consider that culture,
Right,
or
yeah.
who might look at you and say, I don't think the way someone eats pizza has anything to do with culture, right? Which is...
Yeah, there's like, I guess the two extremes,
Yeah.
right, is what we generally refer to as big C culture, which is to talk about like the things that establishments have decided are culture, like Shakespeare or important things from history.
Yeah.
And then you've got the other extreme, which is like when people talk about company culture, is what they're talking about. Is like how people are in a particular context. But those are kind of two extreme different definitions of culture, and there's lots of things that are in between those.
Yeah.
As well.
There's also, culture in the sense or cultural artifacts which are, tangible things. You have, architecture, you have fashion, things you can hold on to. And then you have those more... I'm not sure whether soft culture is a thing, a term that actually people use. But, it's things like... conventions of behaving. As you said, a company culture is a good example, but it also... everyone has conventions of behaving, whether that's, what's the dinner conventions in a specific family, do you all sit around a table and have dinner together, and then, or is it a bit more chaotic than that? Is the telly on or is it not on? That's a kind of, family culture, or even, how in a specific place you eat your pizza. And then obviously language is part of that as well, which is maybe something people don't often realize. Language is culture, and the kind of culture we get in or the specific bit of culture that's sort of represented quite well in Thank Goodness You're Here is humor, right? Humor too is part of culture. It's a question of what kind of topics can you make jokes about, who can make the joke, in what kind of situations is it appropriate to joke, and that will, differ from culture to culture, basically.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that's raised for me by that game, or sort of issues, is that the rest of the world will look at it and be like, haha, British humour. And it's so easy to look at things from another country and say, oh, that's emblematic of what that country is like.
Yeah.
And so someone who's from America might look at that game and go, oh, this is British humor, like Monty Python. And it's like, well, this is humor from a working class coal mining town.
Mm-hmm.
And Monty Python is like people from Oxford and Cambridge. So there might be some similarities in terms of like the use of the surreal or the use of innuendo. But there are like differences going on related to where these people are from. And I think one of the things we often do with culture is we try and make things into national differences when they're not. And you get, I know I'm kind of segueing a little bit away from games, but you see this all the time on the internet, because if you're on a platform like Twitter and you're talking to people from another country, the people who are in that country on Twitter are going to be a very specific subsection of society that use Twitter, right? So then when you get arguments about, recently it was people saying that in Sweden, if a child visits your house to play with your child, you don't give them dinner. Did you hear about this?
I've heard about it. Yeah, I don't know if that's true or if that's
exactly. I'm not saying either way whether it is true, but there are a lot of people saying, "Oh yeah, this is what we do in Sweden," and it's like, well, that's what your social group in Sweden does, and you can only really speak for that social group. I don't know if a different people in a different town or people in a different ethnic subgroup are gonna have different customs, but so often we look for these national things to say, oh, that's what British people do, that's what French people do, and actually it's, oh, that's what middle class people from that country who use Twitter and read this newspaper, and it's actually a much more specific slice, because like culture is not determined by one thing, like what country you're from, or they're all of these things mixing together at any given time.
Right? Culture is, I mean, obviously always much more varied, you know, than it might appear. And obviously, if you're an outsider, you know, to a country, for instance, it's quite difficult to. Obviously, you wouldn't be familiar with all the nuances, right? So, from the outside, usually what you perceive as, first of all, the mainstream, right? And then the mainstream is a matter of not just, you know, frequency of how many people subscribe to that, but also you know, things like, as you said, you know, class and ethnicity. In England, you know, if you think of, you know, what's the standard, if you think about language, right, you know, and actually this brings us back to dialect and accent a little bit, you know, what's standard British English, right? It's the English that's spoken in London and around London, so in the south of the country, right? But that's not the only accent there is, right? So even, and the same with, you know, humour, British, so-called British humour, you know, what is that? Or English humour, right? British humour, even more complicated, because, you know, is there such a thing?
Yeah, because for anyone listening who is not from Britain, like even the concept of Britain and like the Union is a debatable thing here. I think that people who are not from England have strong feelings, and even people from England, really. I mean, when Scotland voted for devolution, a lot of that was based on people I know from Scotland, was driven by the fact that they were sick of voting one way in Scotland and then England voting another way, and then their whole country having to, you know, so there's the whole idea of whether people are from the country within Britain, of like England or Scotland, or whether British is an identity in of itself. We know that in like the global culture, when people say British, they are often talking about English, because they don't actually have enough exposure to Scotland or Ireland to really be talking about Scotland or Ireland when they say
Wales.
British.
You're forgetting about
exactly.
Wales.
And then we would say Gaelic to sort of like describe all of Britain that's not England, right? Which is like kind of unusual and specific.
And also problematic.
So yeah, like humour is a really interesting example. And you also have how people joke about things, you know. We haven't really described the game, but in Thank Goodness You're Here, you're a little guy who gets sent to help residents of a town. And you wander around and sort of interact with people. It's a bit like a point-and-click adventure.
It reminded me a lot of the Untitled Goose Game, which they also has the same publisher. In that, if you've played that, you might have played that one or seen that one. You're a goose running around causing mischief by like stealing objects and then scaring people.
That one is a little bit more puzzly and gamey, right? Because you sort of pick things up, you drop them, use them in different ways. It feels a bit more like a conventional video game, whereas Thank Goodness You're Here is it's like a series of cartoon vignettes, and there's usually stuff you can do in each scene, but it's not repeatable. It's like, oh, here is where I jump into this tube, and I think my favourite moment that just sort of exemplifies what we're talking about is the smacky bum bit. So you jump up on a burger van, there's someone working in the burger van, and you can see their butt crack. And it's like wiggling around in the opening of the burger van. And because all you can do as your character is sort of like hit things.
Yeah.
You can whack them and they tell you off. They shut the burger van. And then there's a little note on the door that says, closed due to smacky bum bum. Which is just like, that's such a good encapsulation of the sense of humour of that game. Yeah. It's very puerile. And we used to have... there's a thing in like British culture of like seaside holidays that used to go on basically before we had cheap international flights. If you go back to like the 50s and before that, people would go on holidays to the seaside, and like the Summer Holiday song by Cliff Richard is all about that. And there was this kind of bawdy seaside humour where you'd buy postcards and they would have like very suggestive jokes on. But if a child looked at it, they'd just see a goofy cartoon. But there was usually some like deeply rude, usually sexual joke in them. And it's that kind of humour.
Yeah, it's very like 13-year-old boy humour.
Yes. Yeah, like Viz was another thing. It was like a cartoon magazine that was similar to things like the Dandy and the Beano, where Desperate Dan and Dennis the Menace come from, but it was like the rude adult version of that. It's that kind of territory. And I think when we started playing the game, I pointed out, oh, this is all innuendo, nothing is that rude. And then like 5 minutes later, we saw quite explicit like male genitalia drawn on something. So yeah, it's quite rude. And I think if you're looking at it from the outside and you're going, oh, this is British humour, then it's sort of this combination of the surreal and this just kind of like goofy rudeness that is very like fart jokes and sexual jokes.
Yeah, lots of penis jokes.
Yeah, and barely innuendo. It is innuendo, but it's so in your face that it sort of stops being innuendo. It's like innuendo really badly done, kind of for on purpose.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like this historical kind of working class British humour. But I mean that's like a very specific example of that, and I think an interesting example from mainstream video games is something like the GTA franchise, right? Because in GTA you've got these cities that are representations of real cities. They give them a different name. So you've got Liberty City for New York. You've got San Andreas, which is basically LA. And the thing that's interesting there when you think about humour is that the creatives behind that are from Britain, right? So the studio is based in Scotland. And one of the things that people have often said about GTA is that it is an outsider's view on America. And that's one of the reasons why it is so scathing in its satire. It's a little bit... It doesn't necessarily punch up or down, it just punches in every direction because, like, particularly if you listen to the radio stations in GTA, they will have a radio station that is like Rush Limbaugh, like super right-wing American, or like Alex Jones InfoWars, and then they'll have another radio station which is like parodying what liberals or left-wing people are like. They don't really... But it's this kind of outsider view on it.
Yeah.
But it's still... it's representing a real place in the world. It's and you can see that from the film references that come in, right? Because GTA 3 was Miami Vice, and then San Andreas was drawing on like real things that happened to Black Americans in that time period, right? Because it was basically set when the Rodney King riots happened, and in that world, the Rodney King riots don't happen, but there are events in the story of that game that directly map onto the Rodney King riots to do with like racially specific police brutality happening. So that's a very interesting series to look at from this perspective, because from one angle it's very crude and it's very like just like attacking everyone, and then there are certain bits of it like that seem like thought out in like a very specific way.
Yeah.
But generally you don't get these very specific cultural things in a lot of mainstream games, because for the same reason you don't get them in Hollywood, right? Because to make something legible to an international audience, you need to make it about the place they know, which is why superhero movies are in New York or whatever, and they're not in Portland. Like friendly neighborhood Spider-Man who's from Portland, or just somewhere less well known.
Yeah. That was sort of one of the key questions that I started thinking about. Namely, how are games, what's the status quo of representing real-ish cultures in games, and then more specifically, what aspects of culture are being represented, how diverse or not is that representation, and again, as you pointed out with the GTA example, who's the team behind doing the representation, and is it representing your own culture like it is in Thank Goodness You're Here, right? Or is it representing someone else's culture, and what are the dangers of doing that?
There was a big fuss recently about Ghost of Tsushima, because that's supposed to be a relatively historically accurate Japanese game, but it was made by Americans. And I mean, Assassin's Creed is sort of a greatest hits of this, and even since the very first game, there's been a big disclaimer as you open the game to say it's made by a multicultural team.
Yeah,
which makes a lot more. I mean, it makes sense in all of those games, because they're all doing this. Like, okay, what's this story like in ancient Egypt? What's this story like in Victorian England? They jump around and they have to show that they are trying to be sensitive to these things. But the first game, it's particularly poignant because it is in the Middle East in the wake of like the war on terror and stuff having recently happened, and then you are basically going to the Middle East and dealing with subject matter that is Christians and Muslims fighting each other. So they sort of had to front load this message of like, look, this isn't a team all of white Christian people, or this isn't a team all of one type of people making this depiction. But I think Assassin's Creed is an interesting example, because you do get the historical places, you get the historical figures, you get, Karl Marx giving you a bazooka or whatever the hell happens. But that doesn't necessarily lead to you getting all the other parts of culture you were talking about earlier. And some of that is just a matter of what do games care about, right? Like we talked about in the last episode of this rarer type of social sim that treats characters more as the focus of the game, whereas in a lot of AAA action games, the characters are just there to like give you stuff or tell you what to do.
So in the Assassin's Creed games, you get you get things that will be recognizable also to an international audience, right? So you get architectural landmarks that you play the game and you go like, oh, I recognize that. That's, I don't know, St. Paul's Cathedral, right? Or whatever. And you get periods in the history of the world that are of interest, right? You get Victorian London, right? You get, is it Civil War America?
Yes, I think so.
So, you get the pirate one, right? You don't get like some kind of obscure century that doesn't really have anything interesting to offer.
And it sort of allows it to put a foot into a genre, right? So the pirate one is doing a particular thing, and you get pirate ship battles, and the one where you play a Native American, it's like, oh, we can do stuff with axes now. It's like dipping into like the other media genres that we associate with those places as well, and those times. The one where you are playing a Native American character, I think that's the third game, and I remember playing that, and I enjoyed it because one of the things that you get to do is just loads of
crafting and collecting resources and not really doing much questing if you don't want to, which is my favorite thing. But this might just be my memory being not very good, but I don't remember getting much of Native American culture, because I think, if I remember correctly, that like child character is I think their mother was Native American, but then the dad was like a colonial English guy.
So they do the double maneuver, right?
Yeah.
Of like, the game is doing diversity by having a character from this group, but also we don't have to put a foot wrong in representing this group because we separate the character from the group and we don't show their family life or anything like that, which is quite. I mean, I've described it in a quite cynical way, but I mean, maybe it would have produced problems if they'd done it in a different way from that.
Yeah, but it might also have been, more interesting and been, proper representation.
Yeah.
And again, that goes back to the question of how well do we represent? Is it a superficial, let's put a token black person, right? Or are we actually doing more than that?
Yeah, and it's also particularly difficult when you're trying to do it in the context of mainstream video games, which tend to be predominantly about violence, right? And you are trying to do representation for a group which has been, historically tarnished as being violent, right? If you think of the history of like scalping in relation to Native Americans, that's something that white settlers did to Native Americans and then accused them of doing. So it's difficult because it's very different to like ask for better representation in the context of games that are about people and games that are about cooking or anything like romantic games versus games that are just like, oh, who do I get to be while I kill a bunch of people, you know?
One thing I was actually thinking about, and again, I don't remember this, and maybe it's something we could have looked up before recording this, but because every Assassin's Creed game is basically based in a different country, right? And one of the reasons they do the whole like big landmark and what aspects of culture are being represented, it's a lot easier to just put some some architecture in there than having to do a lot of research on humor in 14th century Florence, right? and how do we put that in there? But one of the things that I said actually might have been quite easy, and I don't think they do that, is when you play, say, the English version of Assassin's Creed and you're playing the one that's in Florence, have all of the people who are from Florence have Italian accents.
Right, yeah.
And I don't think that's actually done. So, even in terms of representing different accents, usually they go for just standard American or English accents, and then sometimes you have the more main characters. If you're trying to show certain factions or whatever, you might then get specific more noticeable accents for specific characters.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played enough Assassin's Creed recently to know and have a working memory of this. Maybe it's something that if people are listening, they can kind of correct us on if they've seen it. But there are a bunch of different considerations when it comes to putting a broad accent into something. Where it's like, how legible is this going to be without the subtitles on to an international audience? And then
no, in most games, everything is subtitled anyway. You get it written out anyway.
That's true. But there's also, like, accents are used in this weird fictionalizing way sometimes where there might be characters in the world that have the appropriate accent, but the main characters don't.
Yeah.
And sometimes this is a matter of, like, who is easier to understand for the audience, but also it's a way of socially distancing certain characters from the audience. So the funny example... And I guess this is fantasy, right? But the How to Train Your Dragon example, where the adults in How to Train Your Dragon are Vikings, but they have Scottish accents.
Okay.
And the children in How to Train Your Dragon are Vikings, but they have American accents.
Okay.
Right? And that's like how the social world of How to Train Your Dragon works. And
okay.
You can see how, for an international audience... That's like, you're used to hearing Americans in a cartoon film. The kids are who you're supposed to empathise with.
Right.
And there are obviously stereotypes that come with the Scottish accent,
Yeah.
which are also mapped onto things like Shrek.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, this character is, cantankerous and stuff like that. That's going on with, like, making the older Vikings seem different. And I think you get that in things set in the real world as well. I mean, that is kind of the real world in so much as Vikings and Dragons is, I don't know, 50-50. But, things like films like Troy and stuff like that, where you do have some characters that are English and some characters that are American and some characters that appear to be Greek. And it's sort of this weird empathy play of, like, who do you want the audience to associate with? You might have the Mummy or something and no one has regional accents, and then Omar Jalili shows up and he's playing a merchant and suddenly he's got the broadest, like, Middle Eastern accent, and because his character is doing a particular thing that you're supposed to feel a certain way about. So it gets into this weird territory of, like, the accents aren't being used to try and do this, like, documentary thing about what the world is like. They're actually being used to sort of
as a narrative tool.
Yeah,
right?
as a particular narrative device, and, like, to try and make the audience feel certain ways.
Which is very interesting, as a linguist, that how much accents get used as a as a device in not just games, but, as you said, films as well. And again, that's actually one example where Thank Goodness You're Here is an interesting exception, because they that's, even though we didn't end up getting much out of that, right? At least it's the characters clearly are talking in a regional accent, right? Which you
but
don't get that
I think
often.
it's, if you're not from England, it's a really interesting window into these specifics, right? Of this accent kind of goes with this sense of humour.
Yeah.
In a particular way, and I remember it still happens now, but if you go back 20 years or so, regional accents like that were deployed in the British media in a very specific way. And I remember when I was at uni doing my cultural studies BA, one of the things I had to analyse at one point was it was an advert for mobile phones, and this is probably an international thing, but there's, for a long time, like, comms adverts have been just very abstract and just, like, kind of dreamy and, like, I want to connect with everyone. And they did this advert, I think it was Tesco Mobile. There were, like, 20 different scenes of people saying, I want to connect with everyone. And they were all had the received pronunciation accent, like the London accent. And they were all in these kind of dreamy situations, and they were all wearing, like, catalogue bourgeois clothes and saying these vague things about, I want to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then it cuts to a guy, and I can't remember if he had a northern accent or if he had a Welsh accent, but he's suddenly on a white background and he's just like, I just want a cheap phone contract. And they were using the regional accent to sort of, like, map onto this sense of being a real person and being more working class and having, like a simpler, more grounded view of the world that wasn't interested in all of this, like, fluff. And that's, like, a thing that happens within the British media. And I don't know if it's so much now, but we still certainly have a media culture where if you are from a place where you have a more pronounced accent, you are encouraged to train it out. Or you get these, like, comic relief roles where you're the person who's there to either be the down-to-earth voice of reason or to be this kind of goofy, less cultured person, which I'm obviously saying in scare quotes because that's not even a thing that I believe in, that culture is something you can be more or less of, because that is going back to the big C model of culture where being cultured just means knowing or performing the right kind of culture, whereas, it's something that everyone actually has rather than...
There is actually loads of academic linguistic research as well as market research on perceptions of different accents and what kind of qualities we associate with the people who have a specific accent. And I think one thing that's, like, a sort of kind of stable finding that has been around for quite some time is that, at least in England, people find Yorkshire accents as sort of the most trustworthy and likable. So that's something obviously that in marketing is used a lot. So you will get specific accents used or not used because we associate different things with accents.
You can't help it.
So it's like, oh, that person sounds more intelligent or more stupid just because they have a specific accent, or
now I've got this mental image of like, what's the most untrustworthy group of people, like bankers or something, and they're going to a training camp to be taught to have the Yorkshire accent. And like Sean Bean's there, like training them and drilling them on saying bath, and that's like the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, it's a thing in linguistics. It's a thing in sociology. I remember Pierre Bourdieu talks about this when he's talking about education in France and like people from rural areas of France being kind of marginalised and looked down on in the academy because of how they say certain things.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true for a lot of countries. I can't believe we actually talked about accents now, but can we can we get back to representations of real culture?
Yes.
Did you have any other games you wanted to mention in particular?
Well, I think the thing about Thank Goodness You're Here that is interesting is it sort of highlights a thing that games in the indie space are sort of better positioned to do, because they're not trying to... I mean, ideally they want to make a game that sells 100,000 copies, right? Because everyone who makes a game wants to do that. But generally they're working with a smaller budget, which means they can be a bit less risk averse, right? So if you look at Hollywood or the music industry or the the AAA games industry, they are spending so much money on an individual product that they try and sand off all the edges and be as risk averse as possible. And I've been playing Dragon Age Veilguard and kind of commenting on this to you. It's so safe. Every decision about the gameplay, every decision about the characters is so safe. So making a game that is set in such a specific place that is not going to resonate with or interest people is a risk. And smaller teams that cost less to make games are in a better position to take this risk. And I think I talked before, I don't know if we're on the podcast or just on my YouTube channel in general, about how, games publishers are a bit like... they are like record companies or like indie film publishers where they develop a stable of the sort of things they're interested in. So, Devolver is a game publisher that publishes quite edgy action games a lot of the time, or games that are gamey games. They're not story games so much. And then you've got Annapurna that make artsy indie games, right? And Panic, you can already see this through line between... the Untitled Goose Game and Thank Goodness You're Here. These are kind of games about small town life, and they have this sort of irreverent sense of humour, but it's not lofty irreverent humour, right? Yeah. It's not satire. It's goofy.
Yeah, it's a silly little game, right?
It's a silly little game. Yeah, exactly. And like, but they've also got Firewatch, which is not a silly game, but it's also this kind of homely, set in a real place, or like set in the concerns of a small town, which I find quite interesting. And this is not a Panic game, but the game I thought of when we were playing Thank Goodness You're Here, even though it's tonally a bit different, was Night in the Woods, which you kind of look at and think, well, this is furries, that person's a cat, that person's an alligator. But it is set in the Rust Belt, and there's so much background information in the game. And I was watching Scott Benson, the like one of the members of the team who made it, talk about the game, and he was saying that people read it as being very political because it's this game about poor people, it's a game about working class life in a particular area, and it's like they weren't trying to make a game that was all left wing commentary. It's still a character driven game about a character, but when you make a game in a particular place, it's inescapable that the globalization has done this thing, and now the mall's gone, and that's affected people this way, and the sawmill shut down, and that's affected people this way, and this person's got a bad back, and the opioid crisis, or whatever. I don't know if the opioid crisis is in that case, but as soon as you start to root things in a particular place, these other things are kind of inescapable, right? And that's kind of a nice example. And you do get these more middle of the road examples of where it's kind of a real place, but like what's it called? Life is Strange. Is like, as soon as you know that that's a French studio making a game set in America, it kind of clicks because it doesn't feel right. It's got this kind of Twin Peaksy kind of vibe to this place where it's like an American place, but seems to be kind of collaged together from media rather than I don't know, maybe
again it's a question of who does the representing, right? And are you representing your own culture or someone else's? And if you're an outsider, then you only have an outsider's perspective on what that culture is, right?
And even if you research it, right? If I said I'm going to make a game in Louisiana and I go and spend a year in Louisiana, I'm still going to have outsider's eyes and be interested in what I'm interested in precisely because it's different. And I might not focus on the points of similarity as much, and you end up with stereotypes just purely because you can't help but look at the thing that is different, so you end up emphasizing the difference. And I guess what we're getting to is the idea of people representing their own place or their own people in the things they make, which is like a given in like music, right? And it's an interesting thing about the creative industry is that basically the smaller the creative unit, the closer you tend to get to biography and the closer you get to sort of representing the town that you're from, right? Like a rapper can't pretend they're from another town. They have to talk about where they're from. And then like when you get to film, it's like, well, even if our film is not set where we're filming it, it still looks like that, right? So if we're filming in Canada and saying we're in Pittsburgh, then it's still kind of similar enough. Whereas with a game, you're making everything from scratch.
Yeah.
So even if you decide to set your game where you're from, you've still got to reproduce everything unless you're making it with photos. So it's like the larger the team gets and the more technically demanding the thing is, the less of these representations of real places we tend to get.
Yeah.
But I think there are other reasons why that happens in games. And like the classic one is, again, just games seem to default to violence. People assume games are about violence. And then as soon as you do that with real places, it's like, okay, actually, I don't want to run around shooting things in a place I'm from, right? Which is probably why when we do get small town England in games, it's in the context of like a goose attack everyone. Or it might be like, we've got a bunch of video games based on Poirot, for example, right? So you're going to get games set in real places, but it's kind of through this transmedia thing where, okay, we know Sherlock Holmes is set in this place. So we're going to make a Sherlock Holmes game and it's going to be set there because it would be weird to do Sherlock Holmes in America or something. And games are kind of in this weird place in the media ecology because they're always playing off film genres and stuff that already exist. Yeah, but I think one of the things that, on my YouTube channel where I'm talking to people that make games, I'd sort of always try and encourage people to make games based on things that they know about. But I think when you're from a country that's really underrepresented in games, it's quite hard to want to do that in the first place because you might have a sense that Japan is cool, so you want your game to look like it's Japanese, and it's like no one should have to make a game about where they're from, but it's going to be more interesting to people who are, who care about learning about the world. If you're from like Zambia and your game is set in Zambia, than if you try and make a game set in America when you don't have the experience of that thing. So
I think that might also be a part of it, if you're from a small place, wherever that might be, right? Making a game that's set in either a sort of fantasy world or a real big exciting place is just more exciting for you, right? Because you're kind of, you feel like your own little hometown doesn't have anything to offer, or it's it's boring. And so playing games can be escaping to a real world, but I think making games can do the same thing for you, right? And you might not want to make a game about the 500 soul little middle of nowhere village that you grew up in.
Although villages with only 500 people in very good locations for horror. Right? Very isolated.
They are, yeah.
I would say where we live is not that isolated, but I think you could get quite a good horror game around here. There's a lot of spooky seaside stuff. Mm-hmm. We've got the Shell Grotto around the corner, the Margate Shell Grotto, that is very H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, I'm also, because I've just started replaying Disco Elysium, and I feel like where we live, you could do a Disco Elysium Thanad version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that game, there's so much to say about accents in that game.
Yeah, but
right?
it's a fictional world, which is not what we're not talking
but
about.
But Kuno from Disco Elysium could exist in Thank Goodness You're Here. Perhaps not on amphetamines. Perhaps they wouldn't make a child.
I don't have a firm grasp on his accent right now, but possibly, yeah.
Yeah. It's quite ambiguous about when it's set as well. I kind of think it's supposed to be the 90s, because your character is middle-aged and he's into disco. But then there's kids. But it's in a
different. It's a different planet, right? So it's not even parallel to.
We could do a whole episode on Disco Elysium, and probably will at some point. But okay. So I don't think we came up with a better definition of culture.
We didn't even really try, did we?
No,
you said we would, but I think the main point is that culture is a lot broader than you might think it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's things like how you eat your pizza. And
how you hold your pizza.
How you hold your pizza, in what circumstances you can make penis jokes.
Yes.
What else?
Smacky bum bum.
Smacky bum bum. And yeah, that's the most important aspect of culture.
Yes.
That you have to remember.
Want to remind people that on Ibby's website, there is a kind of companion blog to this podcast where sort of talks about some of the same things. There's occasionally different content or like parallel content, sister or sibling content, if you will. And that can be a good place to go. If we've talked about like a specific academic text or reference, then you kind of like, what was that thing they were talking about? We'll usually deposit it there for you. Yeah. If you are listening / watching to the YouTube version of this, then please subscribe to the Indie Game Clinic channel there, which is a channel that is all about indie games and the making thereof. And we also have a Buy Me a Coffee set up. If you want to make like one-off donations to kind of say thanks for running this podcast because it's in an area of interest. We know there must be at least one linguist out there that plays video games. We know there's a few hundred of you that have listened to this based on the stats. So the intersection of games, language, and culture must be interesting to more than just us two. Which is
I
nice
hope
to
so.
learn.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then we would really appreciate a 5-star review, because that's going to help us out in terms of visibility. So leave us a review. If you leave a written review, we're going to read it out next time as well. And maybe recommend us to a friend.
Yeah. Just go, hey, you like games and languages. Listen to say it like you play it.
That's all for this week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.